going to bring in my ball. Okay. Let's open up this and set it back to its default. There we go. 100% diffuse, no reflection. Okay. And I'm going to turn off all of this for right now. Don't worry about what I just did. I know I breezed through that. Don't worry. I'm coming back to it. I'm going to start building this up so we can make a point about this. Okay. You can see the diffuse shading right here, and then it falls off to darkness. Okay. So let's take this and sort of set the camera up like that. Now, I'm going to do a quick render. I get that. Okay. So I'm going to make this a chrome ball. I'm basically going to simulate this surface. Okay? That's what I'm going to do. So I'll open up my surface editor. Now, how reflective is this ball? 100%. So let's do this. 100. And then, what's my diffuse value got to be? 0. Okay, good. I'm just checking to make sure you guys didn't lose everything. Okay. Now, this will be awesome. Let's render. And we get that. Does that look like a chrome ball? Yes. It does. Okay. Okay. Don't repeat that because I just want to make sure the rest of the people got it. What's wrong with this? Is there no light? Let's check. Let's go to the light. Let's set the light. Let's go to light, properties. Okay. What is the reflection amount? What does it reflect? Environment. Okay. Reflects the environment. We have no diffuse, so we're not picking up any information from the light in the scene. Just to prove this, let's just invert this. Let's go back to 100% diffuse and 0% reflection, and let's render again. Okay. Now, if we turn off the ability for this light, there's only one light in the scene, right? So if I go to Scene Editor, open, right? There's only this one light in the scene. So if I turn off this light's ability to affect the diffuse, and we render again, can you kind of see that in there? Still see that? Do you know what that is? It's the ambient light. Does everybody understand that? Okay. Here, ambient light set to 5%. Ambient light is just this terrible property. It has one really useful value, which we'll talk about later, or one useful purpose, but for right now, ambient's terrible. It's dumb. Okay. In a standard rendering setting inside of LightWave, all the ambient light does is raise your black point. Okay? Does everybody know what that means? Okay. So I figured that would not be the case, so let's do this. Let's load an image. Let's go up to. Let's go to the shares drive so that you can all see what we're doing. Shares drive, resources. That'll work. Okay, so y'all familiar with the levels control in Photoshop? Who's not? Anybody not? Okay, let's just do this. This image has a range between very light values and very dark values, and they can be charted in a graph. That graph is called a histogram. And the levels command inside of Photoshop allows you to adjust the range. So if I go into this adjustment layer down at the bottom and I click it and I go levels, it basically puts a non-destructive levels adjustment. This is the range from dark to light. And what this tells us is, rated in pixels, there are very few pixels that are white, none that are completely black, because you see it falls off, but a lot. So if we adjust this by dragging it to the left, it gets brighter. We add more light, or if we drag this one in, we get more dark. Everybody on board with that? Okay. But you see this down here? This is your this is called your output levels, and currently it goes from 0 to 255. It's basically in an 8-bit image, you have 256 possible values to deal with, 0 to 255. Okay. What this basically says is your maximum white is going to clip at white, 255, and the maximum dark is going to clip at 0, which is perfectly dark. If we bring this down, we're basically saying that the brightest white can now only be 153. Does that make sense? So if we go in and we sample that, like that is probably going to be closer now to 153. It's actually, if we apply this down, let's see if I can do this. We'll sample that, and then we click. See how it says 153 now? Does that make sense why that says 153? Right? Because I clipped it. Undo. So the same thing's true here. If I take this black level and I drag it up, what's the maximum black now? 74, right? So inside of LightWave, ambient intensity is this. It's this. That's what it is. Okay? What it basically does is it eliminates your ability to have pure black in your scene. That sucks. Why would you want that? There's no reason to have that. The only reason that you have that is so that you fill in, because basically what this is doing, notice that when we turn this on and we render, notice how like dark that is. Okay? What ambient is trying to do, if we boost that up a little bit and render again, what it's trying to do is it's trying to simulate fill light. Do y'all understand the concept of fill light? Everybody understand that? Fill light? You have a key light and a fill light? That's what that's trying to simulate. So it is, I'll say there's two reasons to use this. One is in standard surfacing, you can boost the ambient to create the sensation there's more light. So if you're outside on a really, really, really bright day and the light's bouncing around a lot, you can get this washed out look. But all you're really doing is effectively telling your surfaces, don't ever be pure black, which is dumb. Really, the better way to do this is to fill it with actual light. So what we'll do is we'll take that all the way to 0. And then if we turn off the diffuse again and we render, can you see it's gone? Does that make sense? Okay, so anyway. Let's turn it back on again. There it is when we render. Notice how we can't see it on the backside? That's good. That's going to help us set up true lighting when we deal with it. But right now we'll set our diffuse down to 0 and our reflection back up to 100, and we'll render again. Okay. We have 0 diffuse, so we are not seeing any semblance of the light. There's no light in the scene reflecting on this. And the reflection value is what? 100, but what is reflection? It's a reflection of what? Okay, what is your environment right now? Black. It's black. It's black, black, black. Okay, is it outer space? No. Outer space has stars and clouds and ice crystals and planets and gas. It is blacker than black. It's nothing. Where is your environment controlled inside of LightWave? Where's your environment controlled? The effects panel. Your environment is controlled in the effects panel. So if I go to the Windows toggle down, and I go to Backdrop Options, it's going to bring up a window called Effects. And the first tab is called Backdrop. Backdrop. The keyboard shortcut to get to this is Control F5. So you're going to come to this a lot when you're setting up your surfaces and your scenes. Control F5. Memorize it. Backdrop. Backdrop. Notice this. If you go to Compositing tab, what do you have? Background. Okay? Background and backdrop, just so we're all clear on this, they're not synonymous. Okay? They do not mean the same thing. If I go backdrop, I'm talking about the environment. If I say background, I'm talking about, like, if I take this piece of paper and I stick it behind my head so that we're, like, when you see me, I got, like, a nice background behind me. That's what that is, okay? Background is just an image that at the end of rendering, after rendering is all done, an image goes funk and gets shoved in there. It just gets shoved wherever there's no physical geometry. That's what the background is. Okay? Background just is an image that gets shoved in afterwards. That's why it's in the compositing tab, because it gets composited in. Backdrop, that's your environment. Backdrop is your environment. And there are 3 types of environments you can have, and they stack in here in order of complexity. Okay, so the first type of backdrop you can have is what? It's a solid color, which basically means your universe, when you load up LightWave, you're dealing with a universe. Your universe is all black. Okay? So if we change this color to pink, yep, and we render again, okay, we get pink. Now the ball is in there, okay? If you want to prove that, you can go to this little drop down on the top that says image and click to look at your alpha. There's the ball, okay? So there's geometry in here. LightWave sees it. The ball is now reflecting the environment perfectly. So, and their environment is pink, so it's reflecting pink. Okay. Just so you're all aware, like in terms of this alpha, do you all understand the concept of an alpha? It's like a cookie cutter, right? It's like a hole. It's like if I take one of these pages on the paper and I cut a hole through it, then this dark area here is just transparent, and the white area becomes opaque. So when we talk about the compositing tab, if we were to drop an image in here, let's drop in that for right now. Actually, let's not something black and white. Let's do that. Okay. If I render again, notice I'm in the compositing tab. Background, if I render again at this point, notice how that gets dropped in behind the object. It goes wherever in the alpha, it goes wherever the black area is. Just shunk, that's where it goes. It's not in the scene at all, so it won't ever reflect that. It has no ability. Okay? So, backdrop. So you have several types of environments. The first is a solid color. That's dumb. The only reason that we default to that is because LightWave was built by people who were space sci-fi enthusiasts, and where do most sci-fi shows take place? Outer space. So really all you need to do is drop in some single point polygons for stars and make them luminous, and you've got stars. Woo! Easy space scene. Okay. So the next order of complexity is gradient backdrop. That basically says, okay, we have the sky. The sky is up. Can we all agree on that? Anybody lost on the notion that the sky might not be up? Okay. Get out. Okay. And the ground is down, right? Because if I look down at my feet, I see the ground, correct? Okay. So I have a range of all the way up to all the way down. Now, in an arc, if I take my hand and I go here to here, what kind of arc have I made? How much? Here to here. I just made a semicircle. This is a shape. What's the angle? If I start here, this is 0, and I end here, what's that? 180. Thank you. Okay, sorry. I'm not blaming you. I'm blaming me. I blame you the next time. Okay? So basically what this does is it goes, okay, there's a range, right? And all the way up, if we turn this on, all the way up, straight up, that's called the zenith. Okay? And then basically, if the zenith is where my finger is pointing straight up, and I come down straight out to the horizon, okay? It's basically the 90-degree portion. That becomes your horizon. The horizon has 2 values. The separator from the horizon to the sky, that's called your sky color. And your separation from the ground, that's all the way down, that's called the nadir. All the way up to the sky, that's the ground color. Does that make sense? So basically you're going in stages from the sky to the ground, and these are the colors. And then when you render again, you get that. Okay? So now we have an environment, and what we can see is we're getting some amount of reflection on this. Okay? And then beyond that, we get into complex environments, which can be found under here, add environment. Okay? And what that's doing is it's allowing us to create either computer simulated environments, which we get with SkyTracer or SkyTracer 2. What's the difference? I can't remember. SkyTracer 2 is newer. Okay. Image world does exactly what you would think. It allows you to wrap an image inside the universe. But it accepts a special type of image called a probe, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then there's the textured environment, okay, which allows you to put textures in. Are y'all familiar with the textured environment? Anybody not familiar with the textured environment? Anybody? Y'all got it? Okay. I'm just going to assume that you're all on board with that. Okay. So this is important, and you want to get this concept, because I'm going to just repeat it over and over until you, like zombies, just mumble it as you walk around Universal. Okay? When you're surfacing your objects, you surface and set them up using logic and reason. You set it up according to logic and reason. What is logic and reason? Well, logic and reason is this. There is a physical law called the law of conservation of energy that says energy is neither created nor destroyed. So if you have 100% of energy coming off of your light and it hits something, it will either reflect off of the object as diffuse, or it will reflect the environment. Okay, so it will balance out to 100. That's logic and reason, and you've all shown that you can do this because I already just showed you a long set of pictures. Okay, and you were all able to figure out generally how it works. So you have your color, you have your reflection, and you have your diffuse. You set those up. If you set it up according to logic and reason and all good things in the universe, and your render doesn't look good, kids, it's the environment. That's it. That's all there is to it. Because you have some very simple properties that you need to set up. And once those are there, if your object doesn't look good, it's the environment. Now, the environment consists of, in LightWave, two separate things. There's the objects around the other object, and there's the lights in the scene. So there's a double pattern here. And so when we talk about the environment, we're talking about the physical lights in the scene. Those are the ones that LightWave gives us to play with. And there's also the other objects around. Does that make sense? Is anyone lost on this? Nod your head if you're still awake. Yes. We all get it? Question? No. Textured environment means that you can put a texture in. So if I go textured environment like this, let's do this. Let's do a new scene. Let's load a new layout. Okay. So now my camera's looking in here. So if I open up the effects panel and turn on gradient backdrop, and I'm going to turn on VPR. Y'all familiar with VPR? Okay, so I'm going to turn on VPR because that's fun. There's my environment. So if I hit camera mode and I hit Y to rotate and I look up, there's the sky and there's the ground. Okay, get that? So if I turn that off and I go textured environment and I go do it along the Y axis and set the texture and I go, okay, well, let's do a gradient. We'll talk about what these are in just a second. We'll set the input parameter. Don't worry, I'm going to blast through this just because I want to get to your question. But if I go, okay, pitch, basically what this is now, okay, a gradient along the pitch. Okay, if this is my pitch, okay, so I'm basically going from up to down. And look, it goes from -90 to 90. What is that range? 180, right? So if I go that, and the parameter is 0, okay, what is that? That's the horizon. So if I go, okay, there, let's okay, fine. Let's turn that off. And let's just turn that on. Oh, thank you. Let's add that to the custom colors. Let's add that to the custom colors. So let's come back in and drop another key in. Let's turn that off. Turn that on. Okay, so that's kind of the sky, and that's the ground. Okay, and we could steal those colors just so you guys understand. That's kind of what that does. There we go. Render. Oh, let's rotate. Let's go camera. What? Yeah, that's good. There's the sky. See it? And there's the ground. See it? Like a little ball. Okay. And there's the horizon. But if I take this, go back to texture, and over the top of this, I add a procedural layer, something like turbulence, and let's boost the contrast a little bit so we see the differentiation. And then let's boost the size of this a little bit. Actually, let's bring the size down like that. What does that kind of look like? Clouds. Okay. It's in the environment. It's a texture that's in the environment. Can you see it? It's
doing it on the y-axis. Okay. And yeah, it's on the sky and the ground, which is easy to fix because we can go in and add another gradient over the top, set its blending mode to alpha, and clip it at the ground. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so the alpha blending mode. Anyway, so not to go down too far that path, but that's what the textured environment is there for. Using this, you can build some really cool sky environments very easily, and you have full control over what they are and what they do. Okay. You guys have already gone through the texturing portion of the lecture, so it's fair for me to show this to you. But let's go to Google. Y'all understand procedural textures? We're going to cover textures very, very briefly because it's not really the subject that I'm going to cover, but we need to get into it just very briefly. But y'all understand there are procedural textures. Y'all understand those are mathematically generated blah, 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 blah. Okay. Photoshop has those as well because if you go in and make a new document, Control-N, you go, I don't know, let's do web. Fine. Let's do black to white, and you go into filter, texture, no, stylize. Is that what I'm looking for? Where is it? Sharpen, render? Where is it? Render. There it is, clouds. Right, that's your fractal pattern. It's basically fractal noise or turbulence. Okay, so the cool thing is that in Photoshop, you're now stuck with that, but in LightWave, it's actually live, which means you can move it around and stuff like that. Anyway. We can go down that road at a different time if you want. That's what that is, though. That's what turbulence is. So it's a fractal. So we take that off for right now. All right, you understand procedural textures, and you understand that inside of LightWave, let's go to that one. And you understand that inside your texture editor, if you go to procedural, you get this long list of textures, right? And those are kind of cool. And you also understand that like smoky does not make smoke. You get that? Right? Just like honeycomb is not there to make honeycomb. You understand that just like the box tool in Modeler is not to make boxes, it's a shape generator. Okay? You get that? Because you all saw that you can make a ball with the box tool and that kind of went poof and popped your brain, right? Okay? These are not textures. Don't get caught up on the name. The name means nothing. Somebody had to come up with a name. They could have called it number 1. Okay, but they came up with something that was a little closer to what they were trying to get at. These are just shape generators. Brick is just nothing more than a shape generator. Don't get hung up that it's making bricks. Okay? But there's a whole slew of really cool procedural textures. And if you do a search on the internet for RMAN collection LightWave. There's a guy named Dennis Pontanier, and he's really fast, and he's really friendly and responsive. I was working on a project for Time Magazine, and I'd have like 1,000 people running around in the scene, and I don't animate, and I found a plugin from Dennis that allowed me to tie the speed of my animation playback to the distance traveled, and I was like, that's awesome. And it didn't work. There was like a problem, and I emailed him one night. I'm like, dude, your plugin's awesome, but it's killing my scene because if it's missing this one thing. And like 4 hours later, he wrote back. He's like, here's a new version. Knock yourself out. It's amazing. Let me get the project done. Anyway, RMAN collection. See all these? Look at this. There's blocks. That makes nice blocks. Remember, it's just shape generators. Okay? But this is a really nice procedural texture set. And it includes things like spirals. So they got cool things like corrugated. And some of these, they're animated. They're self-animating like the waves. So like Windy Wave, it's self-animating, okay, which is really cool. And they got cool things for sci-fi like pipes and all this stuff. I don't know. You can click through these all on your own. But these are really awesome. Self-animating textures and stuff. This one's really cool. Check this out. Raindrops. And particle paint is one of my personal favorites because check this out. And then look at marker pen. Isn't this fun? It's a procedural texture. You basically take a null object inside a layout, for those of you who've been through block 2, and you just move it, and this will track it and mark up the surface. It's neat. Anyway, I would recommend if you're going to stay working in LightWave and you want to advance your texturing that you just add these. They're free. It doesn't cost anything. We have it on the drive, but just in case you ever get lost, RMAN collection. Anywho, told you I'll get sidetracked. Okay, so you set up your surface according to logic and reason and all knowledge that you have, which is basically color, diffuse, and reflection. That's it. And if it doesn't look good, it's the environment, and you have several types of environments. You have your solid color, you have your gradient, and then you have these other advanced ones. And the one that we haven't looked at right now is called Image World. And Image World is different than most of the others because Image World, when we double click it to get its properties, is asking us for this light probe image. Now you can feed any image into this. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a light probe, but it's looking for a light probe. How many of you know what a light probe is? Let me inverse that. How many people don't know what a light probe is? Okay. So there's a guy, a really smart guy named Paul Debevec. Remember how I said early on, like there's these guys and they're like, we've got to solve this problem. So like how are we going to do it? And then some genius computer scientist comes up with some technique, right? Paul Debevec is one of those genius scientists who ended up publishing a bunch of papers. And he came up with this concept called HDRI images, high dynamic range images. If we go into Google again. And we do a search for light probe. Okay, so Paul Debevec. Okay, Paul Debevec came up with this concept of high dynamic range images. A light probe really is this. It's basically a very reflective object that you stick into the environment and then you photograph it. That's a light probe. What makes the light probe used in conjunction with the high dynamic range imagery valuable is that it's able to expose more data than your graphics card or your eyes are able to perceive. How many of you have ever been in a really dark environment like the Dave School, and then you go out, right? You go out, and it's like the middle of the day, and you walk out, and it's like blinding white. Or the reverse, you go off to like break, and then you come back in, and it's so dark you can't see anything, and it takes a while for your eyes to adjust, right? Your eyes are an iris. They open and close in response to the amount of light in the environment. Okay, so your eye is doing what we call an auto exposure based upon the available light in the scene. A high dynamic range image, like let's say this Grace Cathedral, like we'll load this, I'll click it to download it. And these, a ton of these are available on the drive. I hate that, where did that go? Let's, where do I have to open? I don't want to, I want to, oh, there we go. That's what I want. Go to the downloads. Let's cut it, and I'll just put it on my busy desktop. Paste. Okay. Grace probe, that's what I'm looking for. Good. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to go to my image editor here on the side interface. That's F6. It's not imperative that you know that. I'm going to load in the Grace probe. There it is. If I double-click this, okay. You know, if you click and drag here, look in the title bar for the window. You see how we get RGB and it's a percentage? See how that is? Notice how we put this over this white area? Look how bright it is. Is it 100% bright? It's like way, way, way beyond, right? So what's interesting about this is if we go into File and do image controls for this image, we can turn on exposure and we can adjust the light and black point. So we can darken this down. Notice how like we can see now the separation between the windows. Let's put that back at 1. Notice how it disappears. And we can simultaneously brighten the image. Notice how much more detail we're getting now. So if we zero that back out, or I'm sorry, set that back to 100%. Notice how dark it is. Does that make sense? So the point I'm just trying to get to here is that you can have an image that has more available exposure levels than a single image, right? It's brighter than bright. So you remember when we had that nice picture of my my kitchen sink, and there's the counter, the granite countertop, and it's like really shiny because of the bright window, okay? If I just stuck like a picture of the bright window, its max value would be pure white. Do you understand that? But if I actually stuck a reflective ball in there, okay, and I opened up the exposure of the camera. This only works if you have a camera that like you can actually dial up or down, right? But if I dial up the exposure, it's going to get really bright, and then I take a picture, and then I dial the exposure down a little bit more in another picture, and dial it down a little more in another picture, and I go all the way down till it's dark. So I have a range from really, really bright to really, really dark. If I take all those into Photoshop, Photoshop has an option to merge to HDR. That's what it's called. So it will combine all those into one image probe, and that's basically what we're looking at right here. And the point of that is that you now have an object, okay, because this is in your environment, you have an object that is brighter than bright, and you can utilize that to get those really gorgeous looking reflections, which I'm going to show you in a second. I would say in terms of your own HDR, like you have your baseline exposure, then I would go 4 up and 4 down. You could do 3, but the more you have, the better it's going to be. My cell phone has the ability in the camera to dial the exposure up and down. So if I just stick this on a tripod and go exposure up, 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 I think it's got like 4 up and 4 down. So this would work perfectly. So the point here is you can do this. Like Christmas is coming. Silver balls will be available everywhere. Okay? I got this at Target in the garden section for like 10 bucks. Don't be discriminatory. Okay? What? Same net effect. Okay. Okay. All right. So now what I've done, okay, I've added image world, right? So this is my environment, and what I'm saying is instead of having a blank black space environment, okay, and instead of having a cheesy gradient environment, I'm now putting a picture of a real environment in. Does that make sense? That picture that we just loaded, that's a real environment. Can we all agree on that? Okay, it's a real environment. So if you want something that looks real, okay, having a real environment is a good way to make that happen. And so you'll see on set, watch the behind the scenes, and you'll see people on set taking pictures of these. They'll go out with HDR cameras and they'll capture 360 environments. They do that so they can use the HDR to render the environment. That's not always a good thing, but in terms of setting up general lighting, it can work pretty well. You also see the opposite, which will be the sort of matte gray, so that they can get a diffuse sense. Why? Because your objects probably come in diffuse matte gray. Anyway. All right, so if I take this, and the only thing that's worth noting is, remember, it's looking for a light probe. So this will take any image, but what it wants is a probe. And beyond the probe, it wants an HDR image. It doesn't have to be, but it likes it if it is. Okay, so if that's our environment now, and we render, we get that. Okay, we went into this object, and we set our reflection to 100 and our diffuse to 0. And the difference between that and that and that is not the surfaces. Do you understand? Okay? So you set your surfaces up according to logic and reason, kids. And if your render looks stupid, it is what? It is your environment. Okay? I didn't change my surface at all. And this surface isn't really set up the way that we finally need it to, but it's a good start. Okay? So your surfaces are tied to the lights in your scene and to the environment. You set them up, and if it doesn't look good, it's your environment. That's how you troubleshoot this. And the reason that this looks good is because we have a high dynamic range image in there that has multiple exposure levels, and we can do some interesting things. And you'll note that in here we have the ability to boost the brightness. It's truly the brightness, because what it's doing is it's affecting the exposure for that. So if we boost that to 150% and render again, let's crank it to 300. Okay. We're boosting the environment. Everybody on board with this? So now let's go ahead and add in a ground plane. now that you understand that concept. Center it with F2, Q to bring up the surface editor, and call it ground. And let's make sure that's called ball. And we'll save it. Back over to layout, that'll bring that in, and then we render again, and now we get that. Now what happened here? Why does that look a little strange? It's reflecting the sky, but not the ground. Can you all see that? Where's the ground? Why didn't it reflect the ground? Okay. The light is set to affect the diffuse. Okay. Okay. Why is it not reflecting the ground? Now let's talk about that before we go there, because I know some of you don't understand what's happening, okay? Which is good. That's why you're here, sitting here listening to me ramble on. Okay. By default, you want to write this down or you want to at least memorize it. By default, when you turn on reflection, remember how we have that option in the surface editor, diffuse and reflection? When you set reflection to anything other than 0, when there's any reflection in your object will automatically be set to render two things. Two things. One is the objects around it. Okay? The first is the objects around it, the other physical 3D modeled objects. And the second is the environment. Whenever you have reflection on a surface, it is set to reflect two things, the objects in the scene and the environment. How do I know that? Okay. I know that. You all done writing that down? Okay. Y'all got that? Okay. I know that because in the environment tab, it says what? Under my reflection options, I'm going to reflect ray tracing and backdrop. Okay? Now, before we talk about ray tracing, do y'all understand what backdrop is? Right? So if I open up the effects panel, remember, what's the keyboard shortcut for the effects panel? Control F5. Good. So you're going to go home tonight and try to wash your hands. Better not get that off. Okay. What does this say? Everybody? Everybody say it. Okay, and what does this say? Say it. Okay. Y'all understand? So in the environment, it is looking to reflect the backdrop. That means whatever is happening in this panel. Does that make sense? Okay. So by default, this surface is set up to reflect the backdrop, but then we have this other thing happening here. This thing called ray tracing. Okay. Now, by default, you turn on LightWave, it's going to be, your surfaces are going to be set up to reflect the backdrop, that's your environment, and then the other objects in your scene. If you don't see the other objects in your scene, it's because of this ray tracing thing. And the reason, and it's on in LightWave 10, so you guys didn't have to worry about this, but prior, it was always turned off by default. The reason it was off is because it takes longer to render the environments in the scene, okay? A reflection of those environments. You ever seen the notion like you take a mirror and you point it at another mirror, and it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth like a billion times into infinity? Okay? It's possible to set that up in LightWave, just have two reflective objects and point them at each other, and it'll go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Okay? It'll do that forever. There is a point at which it will stop. In the render globals, it's called the ray recursion limit. That's basically how many reflections will it do before it just goes, I'm not doing it anymore. And in this case, it's 6. It used to be, I think, 12 or 16 or something like that. If you set that lower, it'll just kick fewer reflections. There is a point about 4 and lower where it just doesn't look right. Okay, so leave it at its default, but if you want more bounce back and forth, your ray recursion needs to go up. Does everybody understand that? Okay. So the reason that ray tracing was turned off, it's no longer by default, but it was turned off by default, is because it takes longer to render something with ray tracing. And again, when we say ray tracing, what we're talking about is the camera in LightWave shoots out a ray, it looks for other objects, and it finds the reflection, and it goes, okay, well, what's around it? And it sends another ray off of that object, like a little camera from every single pixel, and then it goes, okay, where's that at? And then it feeds that data back in, and it la 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 la. It's really complex. It makes my head hurt. Okay. So it was turned off. But if we turn it on, and it's in the render globals, just in case it ever gets turned off, there it is, ray trace reflection. And here, ray trace shadows as well. We'll turn that on as well. Okay. So if we render again, we get that. Now, just to make this not as lame, okay, we're going to do a couple things. The first thing I'm going to do to make this not as lame is going to go to the ground, and I'm just going to make this a little reflective, like 10%, which means I need to drop the diffuse to 90. Okay, good. And then I'll render again. So that's a little more interesting. Okay. And then you notice how this ground is like very mirror-like. Remember how we had that the things like the porcelain? Remember when you guys were like 60% reflective? No, look how at 10%. Look how reflective that is. Okay? That's how I know it's like somewhere probably under 10. So here's what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm going to go back to the ball. To the yep. These here? Yeah, it's because this is not as reflective as the ball. Does that make sense? If we drop the reflectivity of this, it's not going to pick as much of the environment and light up. Okay, this is a good question though. Okay, so under reflection options, if we dare click this, look what we've got. Okay, we've got backdrop only. That's one of the options. So if we click that, you remember that we have under render ray trace shadows and reflection turned on. But if we render now, because this is set to backdrop only, what's it going to do? Just the backdrop. Okay, just like we had before. Does that make sense? Okay. And then look, so there's ray tracing plus backdrop. That's the default. Then we've got this, spherical map. Spherical map. Okay. Spherical map is basically just an alternate image world. It's an image, you know, want to say image world, you know what I'm talking about? It's the tool in the environment. Y'all get it? Everybody got that? Okay. So it's like a per surface image world. It's basically saying I'm going to wrap a giant image inside of a dome. But unlike image world, which looks for a probe, and a probe is basically a circular image taken from a camera of a reflective sphere. Okay. Spherical map is actually looking for a rectangular image. That's what it's looking for. So if I go into, I haven't done this, so I apologize, this doesn't go anywhere, but let's do Google. And let's do a search for a spherical map. Let's see if let's take that one. Actually, let's take that one. That looks good. So let's save that to the desktop as map. Okay. So then we go in and we go, okay, let's do spherical map, and then we'll load in the spherical map like that. Okay. And then we render again. Can you see it? Does that make sense? Okay. So what it's done is we still have that other image because you can see the reflection of the image world on the floor, but now we've overridden it for this surface. Why do we have that? It's just so you have control. Okay. So you can have a global environment with image world, but you can have a per surface environment with the spherical map. But you understand the spherical map is now doing what? Do we see the floor on this object? No. Does that look very realistic? No. So now what we would do is we would say spherical map, ray tracing plus spherical map. What is ray tracing? Yes. Okay. Does that make sense of what the environment options are doing? Okay. You have 4 different options. Backdrop, or backdrop plus ray tracing. Spherical map, or spherical map plus ray tracing. Make sense? That's what that does. Okay. Now, if you look in here, we have control over the image seam angle. That basically allows us to change the orientation of that backdrop image. Can you see that? So if I toggle back, forth, see how that's changed? Can you see that? That's just me changing the image seam angle. Just where is that going to wrap around? Okay. So some people will be like, setting this, I see this all the time. They go ray tracing plus backdrop, and then they put a reflection map in here. Do you think that does anything? It does not do anything. It's pointless. That's not helping anything. Just set it back to none. Okay. And then you've got this, reflection blurring. Okay. So I'm going to set this back to ray tracing plus backdrop. I'm going to render. That's going to give me that. Everybody on board? Question? What is it, like when we're seeing down here? Why are we seeing that? I couldn't even begin to answer that question. Like why when it kicks it back up into the ball, or is it getting more? All I can say to that is that I think that it's because the sphere is 100%, but let's try it out. Let's go to the reflection amount and drop it to like 40% and 60% and render. See how it gains a little bit less? Okay, so all I have to say is it's probably because you're dealing with a high dynamic range image, there's more value in the HDR than we can actually see. So the more reflective that is, the more we're going to pick that up. That's my guess. That's a good question. I actually don't know the full answer to. Okay. Other way? Oops, sorry. Thanks. Good. Okay. Okay, now, y'all remember, where did it go to? Y'all remember, where is it? Sort of samples, icons. There we go. Y'all remember that picture? Okay. We have a very soft reflection here and a very sharp reflection here. Does that make sense? Okay. So here, under environment, we have the ability to reflect or to blur the reflection. Right now it's 0, but if we crank that to like 50 and render again, see what it does? It scatters it. What does this look like it's done to the surface? It made it rough, okay, like a brushed metal, but it scattered that. It scattered the reflection, which we could also achieve by doing what? Bump map, right? Everybody on board with that? Remember how I said that bump is the scattering of the light? Okay? Because when you have a bumpy surface, it scatters the light. And if the bump is really, really, really small, it'll scatter it, but it'll scatter it in a way that looks like a basically brushed sheen. And so to prove this, if we take this all the way down to 0 and render again so you can see it, and then we go to our basic tab and we say bump, and let's just do a procedural, and let's set the small power to like 3, because that's really granular, and we set the value here, my grid size is 10 meters. How big is this ball? 500, 1 meter, 2 meters, so roughly 4 meters. Okay, so if I set this size to, let's say, 0.001, 0.001, 0.001, just really small. Can you already see it in here? Right? So if I render now, everybody understood what I just did? You all on board with that? I just made a procedural texture and made it really small and really grainy. And I put that on the surface, and look what it did. Yeah, but this is because of the size. If I change the size, it would get closer and closer. Okay? But this is my point, right? There's only reflection. Okay? This approximates then the look we would get from specularity. If we had a really bright light source in the environment, and we boosted a really bumpy surface, very small bumpy surface, it would look like specularity. There's only reflection, kids. There's only reflection. There's only reflection. There's only reflection. That's all that exists is reflection. And this looks really bad, but if we go into our camera properties, and we boost our anti-aliasing up and render again, it'll begin to smooth that out, and we'll get something more appropriate. It probably should go like higher, but yeah. Okay. Does it kind of make sense? It creates more shadows? Let's look. Let's do it. Hang on. Does it kind of make sense? If I take this bump map off, shift click the T to get rid of it. Let's render again. Let's get rid of the anti-aliasing. Okay. Okay. We go back to environment. We set this up. Let's do, I don't know, 35. And let's go back to the anti-aliasing and set it up to 20. Yeah, I'll tell you why that's the case in just a second. Okay. But you see what we're getting at? The point here. So you can get this brush metal look by adding some reflection blurring. It's really simple. It's not hard to do. Now, the more we anti-alias, the less grainy that will get. So if we just want to let this cook forever, then it'll be gorgeous. Okay? And this level here, let's go back here. Remember we set the brightness to 300? Let's kick it back down to 100. Render again. So when you render and you boost anti-aliasing, you understand what anti-aliasing is? Do you understand aliasing? It's the stair-stepped look that you get in computer graphics because of the way that things are rendered. You understand that? No? No? Yes? No? No? Okay. Let's do this. Let's say, set that down, and let's turn off 0. Okay. See that right there? That jagged line? Okay. We go in this jagged line here, these jaggies. That was the bane of computer graphics existence for a long period of time. Some really, really smart people, I can't remember the exact name, I don't know if it was Jim Blinn or Sassenrath or who it was, at ILM, when it was basically Pixar, sat around and sat here for days. How do I get rid of that? And they called that aliasing. That's what they called it. And so anti-aliasing, when we boost that, it's a counteractive measure to provide a small level of smoothing along jagged edges. The point being, it begins to smooth it out. Can you see the difference? Okay, so it's blurring. That's all it is. But it's not blurring the whole image. It's only blurring the edges. And that provides a cleaner look. So that's what anti-aliasing does. Okay. Now, your anti-aliasing, see this reflection samples? That is an internal anti-aliasing that only applies to that property. Which property? Reflection blurring. So, and how much is applied to it right now? It's a level 8 anti-aliasing that's only being applied to reflection blurring. So if I have reflection blurring, it's getting 8 levels of anti-aliasing by default. And if I add anti-aliasing over the top of it, it's anti-aliasing on anti-aliasing. Okay, so that's why it takes longer. So what we're getting here is we're getting this. So if we said to ourselves, screw it, let's just take anti-aliasing down to 1 again, but let's boost this up to like 20. And we render again. Actually, that's stupid because we don't have any reflection blurring. Let's do 35 again. Okay. So now what it's doing is it's anti-aliasing the reflection blur, but it's not anti-aliasing that. Does that make sense? Anywhere you see this samples come up, I want to say as a rule of thumb, when you see samples showing up, it's an internal anti-aliasing only for that property. Does that make sense? Okay. That's what that is. You have objects. They need to simulate known materials, which we call surfaces. You have lights in your scene. The list of options in the surface editor describes how those objects respond to that light. Really, all you need to worry about are 3 settings: your color, your diffuse, and your reflection. In most cases, that's all you have to worry about. Okay. When you have reflective environments or reflective surface properties, it will reflect the objects around it and the environment. Okay? And when you're dealing with the environment, you have 3 types. You have a color, you have a gradient, or you have an image that you can drop in. If you have a scene, and remember, when you're building a scene inside of LightWave, it's like going down onto the sound stage, right? You don't have to build the whole world. You just have to fake enough of it to make your renders look good. So if you're saying, well, we need this, object and it needs to look real, well, it needs an environment. Okay? So you either build everything in the environment or you fake it with a photo of an environment. That's it. Those are your only 2 options, or you just do without. Okay? The reason that this wreath looks like a wreath, the reason it looks the way it does is because of the environment. If I take this highly reflective chrome ball and I go down into the soundstage and I turn off all the lights and shut the power off into the building, it gets pretty dark in there, how good will this ball look? It'll be black. Okay? Okay? Set your surfaces up with logic and reason, and then it's all about the environment. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So now that we understand how surfaces are put together, and now we understand how critical the environment is, we're going to talk a little bit about lighting. That's what we're going to come back and talk about next.